All right, so I don't think that qualifies as a rant. Just a little bit of an aside, maybe. But moving on, we've kind of bounced back and forth between huge games and not so huge games. Frankly, very minor games. Into one that is normally a massive game for the SEC this year. Not as, I hate to say, because it's unfair to Auburn fans, but to say not as exciting of a matchup because you're sending an 8-4 team to the Sugar Bowl, and usually when you're sending a team to the Sugar Bowl from the SEC, in recent history, it's been because they just missed out, and whoever is the best team in the SEC is playing for a national championship. And the next best team is in the SEC. And maybe Auburn is the next best team. It's hard to say who the next best team is because there's Alabama, a whole bunch of stuff, and then a whole bunch of something else. But I think this is a really cool matchup, partly because Auburn's defense has come on this year and built on what Muschamp left, that I think he had in an upward trajectory. So you've got a good defensive team that, when healthy on offense, is a decent offensive team against what I think is an elite offensive team and a really crappy defensive team in Oklahoma. And we've done a bunch of Oklahoma games this year, and Oklahoma fans get butthurt. They don't hear us give their offense a lot of credit, which we do. We're pretty effusive about how great their offense is. All they hear is us say, your defense sucks. But Oklahoma fans, your defense sucks. It's okay. Accept it. Go to a meeting. Find a support group. Just come to terms with the fact that your defense is bad. Your offense is great. And that doesn't mean you can't win football games. It just means you need to get better next year if you want to make it to the show. So now that I've lost most of our Oklahoma fans that were listening to this little segment, give me your thoughts in terms of, is there I think the thought is Auburn's going to get rolled in this game because of the way they finished the season. But is that the case? Do you think that's, kind of what they're up against? Or is there a silver lining for Auburn? And if so, what is it?
I definitely think there's a silver lining. Auburn is not the bad team that they're sometimes made out to be. I mean, Auburn struggled at times this year, yes, but they struggled because they had a lot of injuries. That when they got around that Georgia game, they were just beat up. They went into Vandy without their starting quarterback, Sean White, and without him, they put in John Franklin III, and it turns out they couldn't throw the ball. I mean, they'd come out of a pretty resounding win out of Ole Miss, thumped Arkansas, thumped Mississippi State before that, and everybody's just sort of, I think, taking it for granted that they're dead, and I couldn't disagree more. Oklahoma really struggles at times in pass protection. Baker Mayfield uses his legs to extend the pocket, throw downfield. But, Auburn is a darn good defense. I mean, they're giving up only 78% of opponent rush totals, 89% of opponent pass totals. And that number is down a little bit from earlier in the year. We sort of had a disagreement. I never quite bought in to the fact that Auburn's defense was, especially the pass defense, was truly elite. But they're still very, very good. And Oklahoma's offense is excellent, but if you look at the one team that really just blasted Oklahoma, it was Ohio State. And Ohio State really just ran the football. That's all they felt like they needed to do, and that's all they had to do. And, that's something that Auburn's quite capable of doing. So I think on both sides of the ball, Auburn has some edges. You can say maybe that Oklahoma's a better team in certain ways, but Auburn's a good matchup. They have a very disruptive front seven. Personally, I think they may be the best front seven that Oklahoma's faced. And yes, I am saying that they may be better than Ohio State. And they probably are better than Houston. And that means Oklahoma is going to struggle at times with Auburn. And that means Auburn's going to have a chance in the game. And so, I don't think this is the blowout that some people expect. And, it's a 3-point line for a reason. The Sharps also kind of agree with me that the common perception on these teams that Oklahoma is a 10-win team and Auburn's an 8-win team, kind of going back to an earlier rant we had, right? That, maybe the fact that Auburn is 8-4 just has to do with how much parity is in the conference, and Oklahoma that can run all the way through their conference, go undefeated in conference play, and lose two of their three non-conference games, maybe that's a sign that the conference wasn't very good. So yeah, I definitely think Auburn has a shot in this one, and I think the important thing for Auburn here is, again, it goes back to the quarterbacks. It goes back to the fact that they've got to be able to, basically keep Oklahoma honest. Oklahoma does have an aggressive offense that can score points in a hurry, but I think Auburn has a chance to sort of outlast them, and they haven't been able to do that because they have an injured quarterback. Both of us have said that we think the injury to Chandler Cox was probably even more important because in that Georgia game they were getting the edge constantly. Chandler Cox is a linchpin to the formations they like to use. Um, and when he went out of the game, they were forced to throw the ball constantly. That took them out of their game plan. But I definitely think Auburn is in this.
You know, that's interesting because it's always I'm always curious to see when you have an elite unit going up against something that is a tough matchup for them, and in this case, an elite unit of offense in Oklahoma against a really good defense, maybe elite minus in Auburn. Um, it's interesting because you don't see those matchups very often. Usually there's a huge disparity between the two when you have an elite unit. So it's interesting to me to see if Auburn can score. I think that Oklahoma is in trouble because I don't think Oklahoma is going to get the points that they're used to. And I know a lot of people like to say that SEC defensive numbers are inflated because we don't have – what does everybody say? We don't have good quarterback play in the SEC. And, we heard that last year. Dak Prescott seems to be doing okay, but, whatever. So I think what we're going to see here is that Oklahoma isn't going to be able to score as much as they normally do. But the question is a couple of things. One, can they slow down Auburn? And two, is Shaun White going to play? Because if Shaun White doesn't play, I think Oklahoma's got enough athletes to keep that offense in check because they're not going to get beat edge to edge like Georgia was in the first half of that game before Chandler Cox went down. And if you can't keep them honest, as you said, with the quarterback play, if we're talking about Jeremy Johnson, I think Auburn's in trouble. So give me the score that the model showed. So let's talk about the model. But also, I want, after we talk about the model, for you to be thinking about a score with Shaun White and a score without Shaun White.
Right. And to dig into the numbers again, for those that are unfamiliar, the model, right, we're looking a couple things. Opponent, percentage of opponent averages you're allowing. So weighting the quality of your opponents to determine how good your defenses and offenses are. And we're looking at per play averages, not total offense, because it's more consistent. If you look at total offense, it's really badly skewed by how many plays the other teams run. And we're sort of supposing the fact that points can be somewhat a function of per play averages. So, if I get 4.5 yards per carry, maybe I can move the sticks and score. And maybe if I get 5.5 yards per carry, I move the sticks and score far more often. And if I get 3.5 yards per carry, maybe I don't score at all. And the more, some teams, especially if you throw the ball down the field a lot, like Oklahoma does, Oklahoma has gaudy per play statistics, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, over 11 in one game, yards per play. But if you're throwing the ball over the yard, it also means you generally need a lot more yards to score because, 1 7-yard play and 2 incompletions and you end up punting, where when you run the ball, it tends to be a lot more consistent. I'll actually get 7 yards a play, whereas Oklahoma maybe gets 30 yards one play, 7 yards the next play, 0 and 0. Well, they've averaged 37 yards over 4 plays. That's over 9 yards per play, but they punted. And if Auburn is running for exactly 9 yards every play, they are going to grind you into the ground. All that getting back to the model here, Auburn, 78% of opponent rush statistics, or rush percentages rather, and allowed, and Auburn is only allowing 90% of opponent passing averages. That's a very, very good rush number. It's a pretty darn good passing number. Oklahoma, they're averaging right at 100% of opponent averages. That's pretty darn mediocre. Um, so really, Auburn's defense kind of makes up for a lot of the gaps that Oklahoma's offense generates and how good they are. And the model is saying that Auburn will have 6.6 yards per play, and Oklahoma will have 7 yards per play. Gaudy offensive numbers on both sides. The model is then saying, Oklahoma's a little too much, 7 yards per play. As much as they score, that's a 40-30 win by Oklahoma over Auburn. Auburn's just not quite that consistent offensively, but 40-30 is pretty respectable. However, a lot of that hinges off the fact that Auburn has 7.9 yards per attempt. Now, we've talked about this a lot, but before Sean White went down, Auburn had excellent passing statistics. I mean, they averaged over 10 yards per attempt in 4 of the first 8 games. I mean, they were great, and he was averaging right at 11 yards per attempt. And then after the Mississippi Ole Miss game, before the Vandy game, when Sean White got injured, they have not crossed 8 yards per attempt. They've been averaging about 6. And so the 7.9 yards per attempt is the season average. It takes into account a hurt Sean White. Like you said, Sean White keeps other teams honest. We both felt like he probably should be up for the MVP of the conference because of how much he'd elevated them. That 11 yard per attempt average was doing wonders for Auburn's offense. Probably should have beaten Clemson if they started him the whole time and ran that style of offense. But anyway, 30-40 is taking the average of the hurt and non-hurt Sean White. If you bump that up to 11 yards per attempt, which was White's average when healthy, Auburn wins 50-40 in the model. So it's kind of interesting. It's an 10-point Oklahoma win with a hurt Sean White, or the average with hurt, sort of where they've been at. It's a 10-point Auburn win with a healthy Sean White. And, my guess is the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, but I think he's probably going to be more healthy than not. And you're going to get closer to that 11 number than you will the 7.9. So more of an Auburn 50-40 win.
I wonder, 50-40. That's interesting. I don't think with a healthy Sean White, Oklahoma can score that many points because I don't think they're going to get that many opportunities. Just because Auburn's going to keep the ball more, and also because I think Oklahoma's going to struggle offensively. I can't say beyond Ohio State who they've played that's comparable to Auburn defensively this year. Houston was playing. I know Houston's already lost this year in their bowl game, and they didn't have a great stretch run. But Houston was playing pretty damn good defense in the beginning of the year.
Yeah, and they had Ed Oliver healthy, and they didn't in the bowl game.
That's true because he was very disruptive in that game. But is that fair to say? Like, there's nobody in the same stratosphere as Auburn in terms of who Oklahoma's faced defensively?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I mean, Ohio State is very good, and nothing to take away from them. Highly rated defense, very athletic, disruptive. But Auburn is pretty elite. I mean, Carl Lawson is a top-end pass rusher. Montravius Adams has been unblockable for most of the end of the year. Trey Williams, a 5-star linebacker. Montravius Davidson at defensive end. It's just a great, great front seven.
I'm actually pretty high on Baker Mayfield. I think that last year they weren't ready for that Clemson game. I think they were actually better than the 37-17 showed. But I'll give you mine, and then I want to get your gut score on this. For me, we've we're giving scores and getting into the model a little quicker than maybe people anticipated because it's an important game. But we've talked so much about Auburn this year, and at this point, I mean, we nailed the Iron Bowl. They are who we thought they were, especially with Jeremy Johnson. At this point, I think we know what we have with Auburn, especially when you plug and play these personnel pieces. For me, I think without Sean White, Auburn gets run, especially if the other pieces are banged up as well, like we saw against Alabama. They're just not going to be able to do anything offensively. And I think you're looking at a 42-17 kind of game. And like you, I think this is how just majorly impactful Sean White is to this team. I think they win. I think they win if he plays. And I think it's like I think it's like 37-20. Like, I don't think it's that close. And I know I'm not being a homer. I just, maybe I am. But those are my scores. So we've seen your models. Tell me your gut with and without Sean White.
We're very much on the same page here as we often are. I think Sean White changes this team because Sean White actually gives them a viable downfield passing game that keeps things honest. The health of the running backs is something of a big deal, but the big thing is with Sean White, they're going to be able to put pressure on Oklahoma, and if they can put pressure on Oklahoma, um, they're going to allow their team to continue to score, continue to put Oklahoma in tough situations. And like I don't really agree with you so much with Baker Mayfield. I'm not as high on him, and the reason is, when that loss to Houston, he had more carries than the running backs did. He does not get rid of the ball when he should. He feels like he has to make the big play every play. He has to make something happen with his legs or his arm. And that's great and wonderful when you're playing poor defenses. But when you're playing, multiple NFL talents in the front seven, you Mayfield is not the level of athlete to really make something happen in that situation, and he tends to run into sacks and make negative plays. So with White and without Auburn able to, move the football, I think they're going to score 40 points. And if they score 40 points and Oklahoma feels like they have to match it, and Mayfield feels like he has to make a play, I think you see a lot like what happened in the like in the Houston game where they make a lot of negative plays and a lot of mistakes. Auburn's front seven is going to kind of go to town on Mayfield if he's not willing to throw the ball away. And the flip side is if Auburn doesn't have Sean White, they don't have a passing game. We've already seen that offense can pretty much totally shut down. And Oklahoma is gonna score. I mean, they're gonna score something like 30 points in this ball game. I think pretty much regardless. So if Auburn isn't scoring and Oklahoma is, Jeremy Johnson does not need to be in a situation where Auburn is down 20 and he has to throw the ball to win because Jeremy Johnson is going to throw a lot of interceptions. And all of a sudden, that 30 point that Oklahoma has scored, hitting a couple plays with Westbrook or whatnot, is going to turn more like into 50. My gut is that White is fairly healthy. And because of that, I think Auburn is going to be able to put pressure on Oklahoma. I think this stays close for a while. And I think Oklahoma just makes a couple mistakes. And I have it more like Auburn 41, Oklahoma 30. That's my guess. And I don't know. It remains to be seen, but I could honestly see either team running away with it, including Auburn. If Oklahoma starts making turnovers, that's what Ohio State did. I mean, they threw 20 passes, they rushed 48 times, and they were extremely, they were running for like 7 yards a carry. So I think Auburn is better on the offensive line and the defensive line. I think the Auburn offensive line is greatly underrated. Their interior front may surprise a lot of Oklahoma fans with how good they are at guards and center. Tackles are pretty good, but the guards are phenomenal. And that interior run game may be able to bully Oklahoma. And if again, if they have balance, they can just sort of take it over and run away, and Oklahoma's going to do turnovers, and the opposite will happen. So that's the ball game to me. It may be tight, but I honestly think one way or the other, you're going to end up with a blowout when all is said and done.
And I think that Chandler Cox playing against Alabama and making it back after leaving that Georgia game probably does help their scheme a good bit. But how much of that, I know they've relied on Petway a lot. So where does that leave him if he's not 100%? Does it matter?
I think it does. We both said that when Chandler Cox went out of the Georgia game, that was the real point right at halftime where they collapsed. And it was because with Chandler Cox in the game, they can run power formations. They can pull a guard, lead with a fullback, follow with a halfback power. I said it earlier, the outside was wide open the entire first half of the Georgia game. The reason they went away from it is they lost Chandler Cox. And without him, there were a lot of formations that were no longer available because they don't have another fullback. They had to go more into 3 or 4 wide sets, which meant they had to throw the football. White was injured. They couldn't really throw it, and it's not really what they do. I think Petway was a pretty big loss too, but I think Petway just sort of finds the hole and hits it. Chandler Cox is the real linchpin in that system in terms of what he allows them to do. And in a game where I think Oklahoma struggles with the physicality of their opponents. Again, like Ohio State, Auburn is more physical than Ohio State at the point of attack. And if he's there and truly healthy, and they have some semblance of balance to keep the other team, from just totally walking up everybody the line of scrimmage and crashing, it's going to be tough for Oklahoma to deal with the pounding they're going to take from Auburn for 4 quarters.
And this is probably the game that has the biggest chance to blow up in our face, and we look like idiots. But that's the thing with us here. Going back to kind of what this channel is about, we try to be as honest to the data and what we see as we can, and we don't hedge that much. Like we really do call it like we see it, and the chips. It's a cliche, but the chips fall where they may. So I'm more worried about being honest on the front end about what we see, and I know you're the same way, about what we see and making a prediction based on what evidence we have in front of us as a whole. And if we're proven wrong, we're proven wrong. But our track record this year has been really great, and we stand behind it. And I do think we're going to miss one here and there in the bowl games. This one might very well be the one we miss. But as a whole, with the trend line that we're giving on the SEC, I'm pretty confident that we're going to come out looking okay there. What do you think?
Yeah, I do. I think, we've said it earlier. We both really feel that the SEC has been sort of dogged for stupid reasons because it beat itself up. The SEC slotted into a lot of lower level bowls. And, I really feel like the SEC is going to walk away from this bowl season, you know, proving themselves to be better than a lot of people thought. I mean, you walk down the list, people expect Mississippi State to beat Miami of Ohio. I think we said earlier, I think Vanderbilt probably beats North Carolina State. We're going to look at Kansas State and A&M, South Carolina, South Florida. We'll probably get to a lot of these bowls later, but it's kind of crazy that Louisville is number 20 or number 13 rather, and LSU, who's a phenomenal team, is number 20. Um, I think it's every reason to think LSU is going to give them a heck of a time. Georgia, TCU is a terrible team. So I don't know. I think this is going to be probably a pretty positive bowl season for the SEC, just because they were so underslotted in the bowls they got.
All right, so that's that game. Real quick for you Auburn fans, we'll probably do a little segment on this later in the year, maybe in the off season. But I know I'm going to speak for Husky on this one. But for myself and Husky, we both are pretty high on Jarrett Stidham. Transfer quarterbacks don't always work out, especially in the SEC. But everything I've seen on him is really solid. And I think if you put Stidham on this Auburn team this year, they're 10-2, maybe 11-1, and talking about a playoff run. So I think he's a good quarterback, and I think he's going to be the exact. I know Auburn fans have a tendency to get real high on their quarterbacks in the offseason. Jeremy Johnson, in particular, is the most recent example. But I think this time the hype is warranted. Real quick, you want to weigh in on that, or did I sum it up pretty well for you?
I think it's a fair statement. Jeremy Johnson, I talked about at the time that Jeremy Johnson kind of had similar statistics to some other guys that weren't necessarily so great. He really reminded me a lot of John Brantley statistically coming after Tebow, and everybody was real high. Stidham is not that guy. Stidham has proven it in real meaningful games that he can move the football. I think some people mistake him for a dual threat and want to talk about the next Cam. Eh, avoid the urge to think that he's the great thing that you want him to have just because you want it. Stidham is he's built like Bo Wallace, and he's a lot like Bo Wallace athletically, but I would say that he's good Bo. He has good arm velocity. He has a pretty good understanding of offenses. He's a much headier player than Jeremy Johnson is. I don't think he gets rattled as easily, but he's not an elite runner. Sean White is really quicker and more agile than Stidham. In some ways is a better runner. What Stidham can do at his, 6'3", 6'4" frame, over 200 pounds, is he can run the inside run and keep teams honest on the zone read. if you leave the quarterback unchecked, he'll take the easy 4 yards. But he's not a true dual threat. I mean, Stidham is not going to burn you downfield, not in the SEC, not against real defensive linemen. That's not what he is. He's a downfield passer. The curiosity to me is this is the kind of guy that Malzahn wants to run his real offense. The dual threat stuff we talked about before, that's Todd Graham's offense he picked up from Tulsa, the stuff he ran with Nick Marshall and Newton that he adapted the hurrying up no huddle. What he tried to run last year with Jeremy Johnson, that's his real offense. It just so happens that Jeremy Johnson just wasn't a very good quarterback. So we'll talk more about it later, but I'm curious to see how well Stidham can run that offense.
All right, we do this every week, but that's a long show. We ran a little longer than we expected, but a lot of content to cover. Y'all, we're really excited about bowl season. We're probably going to try to cover all the SEC games. And this is just a taste. We've got a little time before we get the other ones in, but check out the hype video, Auburn and Oklahoma. You got one coming as well. Thanks so much for everything, everybody hanging in with us. We've had a lot of people ask us, even somebody asked me at the grocery store this week when we're going to get the next shows out. So people are listening, people are commenting. For all of you that are still watching and want to comment, give us your score prediction. Auburn, Oklahoma, both with and without Sean White. Oklahoma fans, you can jump into and feel free to debate me on your defensive prowess. I'm happy to get in the weeds with you. Anyway, thanks so much, guys. Have a great week, and God bless.